Today we will be learning a bit about the fourth and final world religion to come out of India. As with all Indian religions, Sikhism also accepts the universal law of karma, samsara, and moksha, although they interpret the path to achieving moksha quite differently from Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. Keep in mind with this tradition, we're actually jumping very far into the future. We've been talking about Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, which all began in the 6th century BCE, whereas Sikhism actually begins in the 16th century CE. However, we're making this big historical jump because this is the fourth religion to come out of India, and it has so many similarities to some of the religions we've been studying already. But just keep in mind that there is a big gap between the religions we have been studying and Sikhism itself. So at this time, in the 16th century CE, there's a lot of antagonism between the Muslim and Hindu population in the Punjab region, which is modern-day Pakistan. We have not yet studied the Muslim tradition, but keep in mind that Islam is a monotheistic faith, so they worship one capital G God. So that's important to keep in mind. So at this time, there's a lot of friction, a lot of tension between these two religious groups that both live in this one geographical area. However, there's also this community known as the Saints and the Sant tradition. Saints are Hindu holy people who were influenced by the monotheism of Islam. So there are people living in this area who theologically are Hindus. They're raised as Hindus, they still identify as Hindus, but they're very much drawn to the monotheistic theology of Islam. So they actually attempt to try to combine these two religions. Even though they still cling to a Hindu religious identity, they worship God in one form. So they don't worship the many individual gods and goddesses of Hinduism. And one of these saints is a man named as Guru Nanak. He lives from 1469 to 1538. He is a householder, which, as you'll remember from Hinduism, is someone with a wife and a family. But he's very interested in this Sant tradition and studies with the Saints and learns from them. When he's 30 years old, he has a visionary experience of God. He goes into a river and he has this overwhelming experience in which he believes that he comes into contact with God, and it's one God. So he is reaffirmed in sort of this monotheistic faith. And this experience of God, within this experience of God, he receives the idea that there is no Muslim and no Hindu. They are the same thing, that the differences between Islam and Hinduism are simply superficial, and underneath it all, they worship the same God, and that God's personal name is Om, which is a sacred syllable within Hinduism. So in many ways, Sikhism is a combination of Hinduism and Islam. It takes a lot of Hindu practices and combines them with Muslim theology. This, of course, became very controversial in India at the time because it was trying to combine the religions of two communities that did not historically get along with each other. So let's talk a little bit about the historical myth within Sikhism. So Sikhism starts with this man, Guru Nanak. He is a householder, he has a wife, he has a family, but he starts studying with the Saints and learning about these Saints. And then when he's 30 years old, he has this mystical experience of God, in which he's convinced of the oneness of God and that his mission in life needs to be to bring these two religious communities together, to bring Hindus and Muslims together to worship the same God, because he believes that they already do worship the same God. They just don't know that. So after this experience, he embarks on a wandering teaching career for the remainder of his life. Very similar to Siddhartha Gautama and Mahavira, he has this experience in which he believes he receives this divine knowledge, and it is his mission to go out and teach this knowledge to others. So he starts going around and telling other people about his experience of God, his idea about the oneness of God, and bringing these two communities together. And actually, as he does this, he combines the dress of Hindu holy people and Muslims, which becomes a very controversial symbol of Sikhism, that it is this visual combination of these two religious traditions. But he does gain a following, and this is the beginning of Sikhism. There are also 10 gurus. So after Guru Nanak dies, there is another guru. So before his death, he appoints who the next guru, which is a spiritual leader of the Sikh community, will be. And this is one person who is named as the spiritual leader of these people. So before Guru Nanak passes away, he designates who will become the next guru of this community, and that lineage lasted through 10 individual men. It lasted about 200 years and comes to an end in 1699. So the first guru was Guru Nanak, and the last guru was a man named Gobind Singh. Well, during this time of the life of Sikhism, as you can imagine, this was a very controversial religious tradition. A lot of people were not happy that this community was trying to combine these two religions. So Sikhs did experience a lot of persecution, especially by the Mughal Empire, which was a Muslim leadership at this time. So many Sikhs at this time were arrested, jailed, and even killed. And many of the gurus actually were assassinated. Many were arrested, and a few were killed as well. So what happens with this is the last guru, whose name is Gobind Singh, creates something called the Khalsa. And it is a response to this persecution that so many of Sikhs had experienced for so long. The Khalsa is a quasi-religious, quasi-military order that is meant to protect the Sikh community. So when Gobind Singh first started this organization, he was asking people who is willing to lay down their life for this religious tradition, who is willing to defend this tradition with their life. And anyone who volunteered and said that yes, they were willing to fight for their religion to make sure that it didn't go away could become a member of this group called the Khalsa. And we'll talk a lot more about what the Khalsa is and what it's become today, because today it is very different from what it historically began as. In terms of myths of ending, Sikhs are also trying to achieve moksha. So they also agree with samsara. They believe in reincarnation, that everyone is stuck within samsara and are doomed to live life after life. And the goal is to reach moksha, to end this cycle of life and death. But they do believe that achieving moksha is different, or how to achieve moksha is different. It is done specifically through the worship of God and the creation of good karma. So again, we really have this combination of Muslim theology and Hindu theology. So you have to worship and show devotion to the one God, but you also have to do good acts to create good karma. And both of those things together can help you move up in future lifetimes and eventually achieve moksha. In terms of doctrine, Sikhism is a monotheistic faith, so they believe that there is one capital G God, but that God's name is Om. So again here, as we've discussed before, it's a combination of Hinduism and Islam. It's one capital G God, which comes from Islam's very strict monotheistic aspect, but the name of that God is the sacred syllable within Hinduism. The name of God is Om. This God is believed to be formless. It does not have a gender, a personality, or a physical form. And worship of this God focuses on repeating the name of God, because the word Om is still considered a sacred syllable, a sacred sound in the universe, as it is in Hinduism. In terms of soteriology, Sikhs see the main problem in the world as religious differentiation. So this religious tradition began as a way to end fighting, end friction and tension between two religious groups. So they believe that any type of fighting or tension between religious groups is false, that ultimately all religious traditions worship the same God, and therefore there doesn't need to be this division between different religious communities. That of course people who are a part of different religious traditions can still remain as a part of that religious tradition, but they need to understand that all these traditions worship the same God, and therefore there's no reason to have fighting or antagonism between them. In terms of cosmology, where Sikhs look to find the truth about the world, they look through this notion of guru and guruship. So a guru is a spiritual leader. It is someone or something in this world that can help guide you towards God or give you information as God. So it's basically who or what is your spiritual teacher in this world. So the line of individual gurus, men who were the primary leader of the Sikh community, lasted for 10 gurus. At the end of the life of the 10th guru, he declared that there would no longer be a single guru for the Sikh community. That time had now passed, and there would, from that point on, be 4 different types of gurus that an individual Sikh could look to. So the first one is God. So for every Sikh, God is always supposed to be your number one guru. That is your primary teacher and source of knowledge about the world and about God. So you can look to God and ask to God for help and instruction. The second notion of guruship is one's teachers. So these are individual Sikh leaders or individual Sikh spiritual men or women. So instead of just having one guru, male or female, who is the worldwide leader of Sikhs, Sikhism no longer has that. Any sort of spiritual leader, whether it's a parent or a religious leader at your local temple, can also be a guru to you. Anyone who teaches you something about Sikhism can become your guru. The third guru is the Adi Granth, and the Adi Granth is the sacred text of Sikhism. The words Adi Granth actually translate to first book. This sacred text is a compilation of primarily poetry. A lot of it is poetry that Guru Nanak wrote himself, that other men and women from the Sant tradition wrote, and that other both Hindu and Muslim poets wrote about God. So it's primarily a compilation book of poetry, but sacred and divine poetry about the nature of God. But this is the sacred text for Sikhism, and it is also looked to as a source of knowledge. So if you want to know more about God and truth, you look to the Adi Granth, to this sacred text. And lastly, the Sikh community is seen as your guru as well. So anyone within the larger Sikh community can also become your teacher because you can learn from the community as a whole. So there's no longer a single guru, but God, teachers, the Adi Granth, and the larger Sikh community can now be your guru. In terms of ritual, on a daily basis, Sikhs are encouraged to show devotion or bhakti towards God. So again, it's still using the Hindu term of bhakti, but it's towards the one individual God, or the one all-powerful God. And Sikhs are encouraged to pray 3 times a day. That's something that is seen as a good way to show one's bhakti towards God. On a weekly basis, Sikhs do have sort of a weekly service, a congregational worship. This usually involves the coming together of Sikhs as a community in their local temple, and will have some sort of reading from the Adi Granth, which anyone in the community can do. So they'll read some sort of section from the sacred text, and then someone will give some sort of lecture or sermon on how to apply the reading to one's everyday life. Following these congregational worships is always something called the langar, and the langar is a free meal for anyone in the community who wants to come and join. This tradition began in the life of Guru Nanak, that the community would prepare this meal. It's always a vegetarian meal. And anyone, whether they are Sikh or not, was invited to come to the temple to participate in this langar, this free meal. So this tradition continues today, and at any Sikh worship meeting, the service itself will always be followed by this very large meal, this very large feast that everyone is welcome to join in and be a part of. On a yearly basis, Sikhs also celebrate Holi and Diwali, just like Hindus do, but they do celebrate them for different reasons. Holi is actually dedicated to military exercises or organized athletic or literary contests. So it's focused on sort of the younger community, and we'll talk about how that's related to the Khalsa in just a minute. But that's what the Sikhs do on Holi, instead of celebrating it in the same way that the Hindu community does. Sikhs also celebrate Diwali, and they celebrate it in a very similar way. They do also light lamps, as Hindus do, but they believe that Diwali is the day that one of their gurus, Guru Hargobind, was put in jail by a Mughal emperor. So they commemorate the imprisonment of one of their former leaders during that day. So they celebrate the same festivals, the same holidays, but there's different spiritual reasons behind those holidays. In terms of life cycle, a very important decision that a Sikh can make can be whether or not they want to join the Khalsa. So as we mentioned before, the Khalsa was a quasi-military order started by the last guru in Sikhism, and it was meant to be a military-type group that would be willing to defend the faith, that would be willing to defend Sikhism under the persecution that it was undergoing at that time. Usually people enter the Khalsa when they're a young man or a young woman, so the Khalsa is open to both boys and girls. Today, however, the Khalsa means something very different than it meant at that time. The word Khalsa actually translates to pure, and today the decision by a young boy or young girl to decide to enter into the Khalsa usually just means that they are willing to take on a stronger commitment and ethical requirements. So it is showing one's devotion to Sikhism. So usually boys and girls, when they're about 13 or 14, that's when they make the decision whether or not they want to join the Khalsa. This is not a mandatory part of being a Sikh. It's something that someone voluntarily takes on. And as I said, today it really just means that you are strongly dedicating yourself to your religious tradition and dedicating yourself to live by a higher ethical standard than others are required to live by. If someone decides to become a part of the Khalsa, they have to wear or do the 5 Ks, and these are visual symbols of being a part of this group. These are also in the textbook, so you can take a look at them in the textbook, but we'll go over them briefly here. The first one is the Kes. Kes is uncut hair and beard, if it's a boy. So Sikhs who are members of the Khalsa do not cut their hair. Their hair grows very long, and they usually wrap it into a bun and then put a turban on top of it. So having the uncut hair is one symbol that you are a member of the Khalsa. The second one is the Kanga, which is a comb worn in the hair. So as I said, your hair grows very long, and it's usually worn in a very tight bun. The bun is secured by this kanga or comb, so that's another symbol that members of the Khalsa always have or wear. The third one is the kirpan, which is a steel dagger or sword. So traditionally, members of the Khalsa always carried a sword with them, and this symbolized their readiness to fight for their faith and defend the innocent. Today, of course, it is not very common or recommended to walk around carrying a very large sword. So the kirpan has actually become smaller and smaller over the years, and today it's only a couple inches long. It's a very small sword, and it's more ceremonial and symbolic than anything else. But members of the Khalsa do have to carry this kirpan with them at all times. So it's usually kept like in a side pocket or something like that, but it is supposed to be kept on the person at all times. The fourth one is the kara, which is a steel bracelet worn on the right wrist. So this is also a visual symbol that one is a part of this community, the Khalsa community. And the last one is kak, which are shorts. So these are similar to boxer shorts. They're a type of undergarment that's always worn underneath the clothing. So if a boy or girl decides to become a member of the Khalsa, then they have to wear or have these 5 Ks at all time, and that is a requirement for becoming a member of the Khalsa. In terms of ethics, Sikhs believe in one universal God, so they believe that there is no need for separate religious communities, that all the separate religious communities actually worship this one universal God. So there's the differences between religious communities, in particular between the Hindu community and the Muslim community, are just superficial, and that one needs to look beyond these superficial differences to see the similarities between these religious traditions. So related to that, there is a high degree of emphasis on tolerance within Sikhism, that Sikhs need to be tolerant of other religious traditions and to understand that they have more in common with these other traditions than might seem to be true at first. So there's an ultimate sort of attitude of tolerance and acceptance to other religious traditions. However, there is also the idea of justified violence in defense of the religion or holy sites. So because Sikhism was a tradition that was so controversial and so highly persecuted in its early days, there is an ethic of justified violence, that it is okay to defend oneself and to defend one's community if and when it is attacked. So that is also a strong ethic within this community as well, that if the Sikh community or an individual Sikh member is attacked, then you have the right to defend yourself or defend that community or that Sikh member. Sikhs are also against the caste system. So we talked a little bit about the caste system in Hinduism, but Sikhs reject castes, and they believe that we should live in an egalitarian society where all people are considered equal. In terms of experience, Sikhism has both numinous and mystical experience. Numinous because there is a capital G God, there is one universal God for Sikhs who is transcendent and beyond all human characteristics. So this God has no form, has no gender, cannot be drawn in a physical way, anything like that. So this is the God before which you would have that numinous experience. The name of God is Om, which is a sacred syllable. So worship of God, experience of God is focused on chanting and speaking the name of God, Om. However, Sikhism does have a very strong mystical emphasis as well. And this can be traced back to the experience of Guru Nanak, that Guru Nanak began this tradition when he had a strong mystical experience of God. When he had this experience of God in the river, he actually described it as drinking the sacred nectar of God. So very much this experience of feeling and experiencing God within oneself. And the Adi Granth itself is a book of devotional poems and hymns of all these sant poets and Hindu gurus that were very much into the mystical experience of God. So a lot of the poetry within the Adi Granth itself talks about mystical experiences of God. And the reading of the Adi Granth is actually also supposed to be a mystical experience, that it allows one to understand God and experience God in a very personal, intimate way. And that's a form of devotion or bhakti for Sikhs. And lastly, in society, Sikhs have had sort of a troubled relationship with larger society, in large part due to the fact that they have this history of persecution and being a minority within India. So they have always historically been a minority in India, which is mostly Hindu. They lost political leadership in the Indian parliament many years ago, so they don't have a very strong governmental representation within India. So a lot of times they are sort of left to this minority status. They also are against the caste divisions, which we mentioned already, so they believe that India should get rid of the caste system and should be an egalitarian society. There was a major incident in 1984, which very much turned the history of Sikhism and the Sikh community within India. At this time, Sikhs had lost their political leadership in Indian parliament, and many Sikhs, not all Sikhs, but some Sikhs, wanted the creation of an independent state within India for Sikhs. So remember, this is after Pakistan had actually achieved that status. They had gained an independent state for the Muslim population in India, and several years later, Sikhs were calling for the same thing. They wanted the creation of a Khalistan, an independent state just for Sikhs within India. to show the sort of force behind this want, many Sikhs actually staged a protest at a place called the Golden Temple, which is the most holy site for Sikhs in India. It's a very large temple, and it's a place where Sikhs, all the Sikh community in India comes together at special religious and festival days throughout the year. So this group of people that wanted this independent state staged a sit-in, a protest at the Golden Temple. Well, the prime minister at the time, a woman named Indira Gandhi, gave the armed forces permission to storm the Golden Temple, to forcefully remove these protesters. So this became a violent struggle. These soldiers went in and actually killed many of the Sikh members who were staging this protest there, including the leader of this movement. So it was a very bloody and tragic incident that occurred at the Golden Temple. And for many Sikhs, this was very upsetting because it was such a holy site for them. And the idea of violence and death and blood in this most holy of sites was very sacrilegious to them. It was very blasphemous that this would occur at their most sacred site. So shortly after this incident, Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister, she had several Sikh bodyguards, and one of her Sikh bodyguards actually assassinated her in retaliation for this incident. This was a very tragic event that many Sikhs mourned as well. Not the entire Sikh community was behind this protest movement, but it was a very tragic event for both sides, and was one that is a very sort of strong, tragic incident in the history of Sikhism, and something that's left its mark on contemporary Sikhs today. So it's important to know about that incident and how it's changed the Sikh community within India. There was also a major incident in America last year, in 2012, which was a shooting at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. You may have heard about this incident, but an individual, a man, who sort of mistakenly conflated Sikhs and Muslims, went into a Sikh temple during a service and killed several people. The man obviously had some mental health issues, but mistakenly thought that he was in some way retaliating for 9/11, even though the Sikh community is not a Muslim community, and had nothing to do with that incident. So it was a very tragic event that happened in recent American history in terms of people being ignorant and not knowing about this community. So that's something that has also been very tragic for the American Sikh community here in America.